At my grandson's party, the air was full of sweetness, frosted cupcakes, faint perfume, the helium hiss of balloons brushing the ceiling, and yet something about the day felt off. I've lived long enough to sense when something's missing, even when no one says a word. It's in the way people laugh too loudly, the way their eyes dart when someone's name is nearly mentioned, the way silence settles like dust in the corners of a room that should be alive with joy. That morning I had worn my soft lilac sweater, the one with the pearl buttons he used to love fiddling with as a toddler. It was supposed to be a special day. His birthday. His 8th, I think, though lately, the years have started slipping through my hands like flour when I bake. The family had gone all out. Streamers curled across the porch railings like party serpents. There was a bouncy castle in the backyard, inflated and swaying like it was breathing. I remember thinking it looked like a creature too big for the space it was given. How fitting in hindsight. Inside the house buzzed with activity. My daughter-in-law was arranging platters of finger sandwiches, her voice tight behind her smile, as she directed people where to stand, where not to stand, what not to spill. My son hovered around her like a satellite, carrying out orders, laughing when she laughed. It should have made me proud to see them so organized, so committed to making the day perfect. But I just kept watching the door. Each knock or jingle of the bell made my heart lift a little, maybe this time. But every face that stepped through was a neighbor, a coworker, someone from church. I waited for the one face I knew should be there, the one that would peek in eyes, hopeful, voice soft, "Hi, Grandma." But it never came. I didn't ask, not right away. That's something age teaches you, not to barge into a moment before it's ready to speak. So I sat. I watched my grandson open his gifts. I clapped when he unwrapped a plastic robot that lit up and sang. I laughed when he smeared blue icing across his cheeks and wiped it on his mother's skirt. But under the surface, something in me was ticking quietly, marking the absence of the girl who should have been laughing beside me. The last time I'd seen my granddaughter was, well, it had been a while, months, maybe a year. We used to be so close. She'd braid my hair and tell me about her terrible dates, her job interviews, the books she was reading. I knew the rhythm of her voice better than my own breath. But recently, it was like she had been airbrushed out of the family's life. No photos of her in the hallway, no mentions of her in conversation. Even when I brought her name up, their faces would tighten their answers vague. I told myself she must be busy. Life happens, people drift. But no, this wasn't that kind of drift. This was deliberate, sharp-edged, like someone had cut her out with a scalpel and stitched the skin back together to hide the scar. At the party, I wandered into the kitchen to refill my tea. That's where I caught my daughter-in-law looking at her phone, whispering something to a cousin. "No, she's not coming," she said, like it was a relief. "We didn't invite her." Then a pause. "You know how she is. She brings drama. It's just better this way." That sentence, I didn't even feel it at first. It passed through me like wind. But then it circled back. We didn't invite her. I stood there a moment longer than I should have, tea kettle in hand, pretending I hadn't heard, pretending my heart hadn't just cracked like fine china. I went back to the living room, sat down slowly and folded my hands in my lap. They had planned this whole thing without her, chosen not to include her, excluded her from a day that was meant to be about family, about love. And not just because of an oversight or a scheduling mix-up, but because they decided she didn't fit, like she was some mismatched puzzle piece too jagged for their polished picture. I kept my face still smiled when people passed me cake, but inside I felt the slow burn of shame. Not shame for her, for them, for what they were doing, for how easily they had convinced themselves it was okay, that it was justified, that she didn't belong. And that's when it began. Not rage, not even grief. Just a quiet, bitter resolve settling in the corners of my chest. I'd lived long enough to know when a moment changes everything. And this was it. I saw them clearly, maybe for the first time. Not as my children, not as the people I raised, but as adults flawed, selfish, and blind. That night after the candles had been blown out, and the guests filtered away with their goodie bags and fake smiles, I sat alone in the guest room, her old room now turned into storage. I looked at the bed we used to sit on together, the books we'd read. I held one of her old sweaters to my chest and finally let the tears fall. They hadn't just left her out of the party. They had left her out of the family. I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would notice her absence the next day. That someone would call me, apologize, say it had been a mistake. I waited beside the phone like a girl waiting for a letter that never comes. But all that came were photos, text messages, a group chat filled with pictures of balloons, children laughing, little boys playing superheroes in the yard, and not a single word about the missing chair at the far end of the table, not a single mention of her. The silence after the celebration was louder than the party itself, and it wasn't empty, it was heavy, weighted with something everyone seemed to be pretending not to feel, except me. I was the only one who seemed to remember what had been lost. A week passed before I brought it up carefully, cautiously, like handling glass. I was on the phone with my son, and I slipped the question in between updates about his work and the weather. I didn't see her at the party, I said, trying to sound casual. Is everything all right with her? There was a pause. Not hesitation, annoyance. Mom, he said, his voice taking on that tone he reserves for things he doesn't want to explain. You know how she is. She's just not good for the family dynamic right now. I let that sit there echoing. Not good for the family dynamic. Like she was a broken ornament they'd boxed up and put in the attic because it didn't fit with the decor. I asked him what that meant. How could someone who is family not be good for it? He exhaled hard like he was the one burdened. She's just always involved in something. Arguments, drama, people getting upset. And she makes things tense with your daughter-in-law. She didn't even RSVP, so I closed my eyes. He was lying, or worse, believing his own version of the story, the way people do when it makes things easier. But did she know she was invited? I asked gently. Look, Mom, I don't want to argue with you about this. Let's not make it a big thing. But it was a big thing, not because of the party, but because of the pattern. Because I was finally starting to see the edges of something they had been trying to hide. My granddaughter hadn't disappeared. She'd been erased. I started going back through my memories, trying to find the cracks I hadn't noticed before. The holidays she missed, the birthdays she called me crying after, the times I thought she was just overwhelmed with work or life, and I took the vague explanations at face value. I remembered her text messages getting shorter, her visits less frequent, her voice a little more tired every time we spoke. How had I missed it? When she was little, she used to climb into my bed on weekends and whisper her worries into the space between our heads. I'd braid her hair and tell her stories about how strong women have always been quiet warriors, carrying the weight of worlds on their shoulders with no applause. She had my fire, my sharpness, my heart. And I had thought naively, maybe that the family would see in her what I saw, that they would cherish her the way I did. But families don't always grow in straight lines. Sometimes they twist in ways you don't expect. Sometimes the branches rot without you noticing. A few days later, I sat with a photo album on my lap, flipping slowly through the years. There she was, laughing in the snow, covered in flour after baking, blowing out candles. It was all there in glossy paper. A life shared, love shown, smiles frozen in time. And yet in the living world they had already started pretending she never existed. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, not from age but from fury, a kind of slow burning rage that only the elderly can understand. Not the screaming kind, but the kind that settles behind the ribs and grows roots. She had been pushed out, and they had all decided it was better that way. That night I called her. I didn't care if it had been months. I needed to hear her voice. She answered on the third ring, quiet, at first unsure. "Grandma," she said, like she didn't trust the sound of it. "Hi, darling," I whispered. "I missed you." There was a pause, then a soft, shaky breath. "I didn't think you'd want to talk to me." That's when I knew. They hadn't just pushed her out. They had turned her against me too. "I always want to talk to you," I said. "Always." She sniffled. And then she said something that made my heart twist in my chest. "I thought you believed them." Them, the ones who painted her as difficult, as dramatic, as disposable. "I don't," I said. "Not anymore. I see it now." There was a silence between us, but it wasn't empty. It was full of years, of memory, of quiet forgiveness starting to bloom like a late spring flower. We didn't talk long, just enough for her to know I loved her, that I missed her, that I remembered, that I was still here. After we hung up, I sat in the dark and thought about how easy it is to lose someone without meaning to. All it takes is silence, a few missed calls, a few doors closed, and suddenly someone you love is outside watching the family gather without them. Not on my watch, not anymore. It was a few days after that quiet phone call when I found myself lingering at the cake table in the dining room, the same one where my grandson had blown out his candles, where people had laughed too loudly, where my daughter-in-law had brushed crumbs from a cloth napkin, with the elegance of a hostess, pretending perfection. I remember running my fingertips along the edge of that table, feeling the tiny scratches from years of use, tiny scars in the wood that no centerpiece could hide. That table had seen everything, every birthday, every tearful Thanksgiving, every whispered secret between sips of coffee. And yet somehow it had managed to host a celebration that deliberately erased someone it once embraced. I stood there longer than I should have, maybe hoping for some kind of revelation, maybe just needing to feel the weight of that day again. But instead I found myself thinking back not just to my granddaughter, but to the way people in this family have always handled discomfort with silence, with gentle smiles and unspoken rules, with locked doors and words unsaid. She didn't fit their aesthetic anymore. That's what it boiled down to. She didn't blend with the curated image they were building like a Pinterest board complete with monogrammed gifts and pastel balloons and family photos carefully cropped. And maybe it started small. A look here, a whispered judgment there. The kind of things that young women pick up on, especially the ones with hearts like radar dishes, sensitive to every shift in tone, every withheld compliment. They say she was difficult, but what they meant was she challenged them. She didn't pretend to be smaller to keep the peace. She spoke up when things felt wrong. She cried too loudly, loved too honestly, questioned the games they all agreed to play. She stopped being easy to dismiss, and that's when they stopped making space for her. I tried to imagine how it must have felt to realize you weren't invited, to hear that your family gathered without you, that your name wasn't even mentioned while your little cousin unwrapped gifts in front of a cake you once helped bake for someone else's party. I thought of her getting dressed that day, maybe still holding out hope for a call, a text, an invitation that never came, or maybe she already knew better. And then came the voices. My son's cousin, the one with the always perfect hair, and the ever-present wine glass laughing in the hallway. It's just less stressful this way. You know how she gets. Always some drama. A pause, then a scoff. She probably would have brought that ex of hers again. Can you imagine? That was when something cracked inside me, because I could imagine. I remembered him. I remembered the boy with the two soft eyes and the way he used to carry her bags without being asked. He wasn't perfect, no. None of us are. But he tried, and he cared. And more than once I saw how his presence helped her breathe easier. And maybe that's what the others couldn't stand, seeing someone love her in a way they didn't know how to. They called him a mistake. But maybe he was just a mirror, one that showed her she deserved better than the love they were willing to give. I left the hallway before they noticed me, went to my room, closed the door behind me slowly like sealing myself in, and I sat. I didn't cry, not then. I just stared at the blank notepad I keep on the dresser, the one where I write grocery lists and reminders to take my pills. But that night, I wrote something else. Her name. And below it, I see you. Sometimes that's all someone needs. Not rescue, not revenge, just to be seen. That night, I looked up her ex on social media. Took me a few tries. These apps always change the buttons, but eventually I found him. His face looked older, wiser maybe, sadder too, but still kind, still steady. The kind of man you might overlook in a loud room but remember in a quiet one. I hovered over the message button. My fingers shook, not from fear, from the weight of doing something no one else would. I typed slowly. Hello, I know it's been a long time, but I'd like to talk if you're willing. It's about her. I stared at it, reread it, then I hit send. I didn't know what I was doing, not exactly. But I knew I couldn't let the story end like this. I couldn't let her be pushed out and locked away and labeled too much while they toasted with champagne and called it peace. No, she was never the problem. The problem was a family that forgot how to love loud women, that mistook silence for stability, that traded authenticity for appearances. And I had helped build that family. Maybe I couldn't change the past, but I could make room in the present. I could turn the key that others had thrown away, and I could remind her through action, not just words, that she still belonged somewhere, that not everyone had forgotten. The message was read an hour later. No reply at first, just the little scene dot. But it was enough. The next morning, just as the light slipped through the blinds and long golden stripes across my quilt, my phone buzzed. It startled me. I rarely get messages that early, and the only people who text me anymore are trying to sell me insurance or remind me of doctor's appointments. But this time, it was him, her ex. His message was short, polite. Of course, I'd be honored to talk. When would be good for you? There was no bitterness, no confusion, no hesitation, just quiet readiness. The kind you only hear in people who've spent years sitting with their pain until it softened at the edges. We scheduled a call for that evening, and all that day I felt like I was carrying a small secret in my chest, like a candle I had to shield with my hands from the wind. I made tea the way I always do, chamomile with honey, and I waited with the phone beside me, heart drumming slowly like it used to, when I knew someone I loved was on the other end of the line. When his voice came through, it was deeper than I remembered, slower too, but kind, grounded, and most of all grateful. He thanked me for reaching out before I'd even said anything. Told me he hadn't expected to ever hear from anyone in our family again, that he assumed the silence was permanent. I told him the truth, that it had been too long, that I didn't know what exactly happened between them, and I wasn't calling to dig through old wounds. I just needed to talk to someone who remembered her the way I did. Someone who loved her not for her potential or her place in the family tree, but just for who she was. He told me about the last time he saw her, how she'd looked so tired, how she tried to smile through it, how she kept brushing things off like they didn't matter. But they did. They always did. He said he could tell she was carrying a weight she wouldn't name, that the family had started turning on her quietly. Little slights, sudden cold shoulders, invitations that got lost, calls that stopped getting answered. He said she kept blaming herself. She said maybe she was too much. He told me, his voice cracking slightly, that maybe everyone else was right. Those words cut deeper than I expected. I felt them like splinters under my skin, because I remembered her saying the same thing to me once years ago, after a Christmas dinner when she cried in the bathroom for an hour because someone made a joke about her being over-emotional, and I had told her she was fine, that it was just a joke, that she needed to toughen up. God, how wrong I'd been. I told him about the party, about the way they talked about her like she was a burden, an embarrassment, a ghost they were glad to forget. I told him I didn't agree. Not anymore. That I was tired of pretending family meant blind acceptance. That sometimes love means standing apart from those closest to you when they forget how to be human. There was a long pause on the line after that. Then he said something I won't forget. She always said you were the only one who really saw her. I think that's why it hurt so much when she thought you didn't anymore. That nearly undid me. Because he was right. I had gone quiet too. I had let the silence settle, let the phone go unanswered too many times. I had trusted the version of events my children fed me, instead of listening to the girl whose heart used to beat in time with mine. We talked for over an hour about her, about the things she loved, her writing, her paintings, her stubborn belief in people's goodness, even after they hurt her again and again. And by the end of it, I realized something. She hadn't been the one to bring drama. She had been the one asking for honesty in a family built on secrecy. She hadn't caused tension. She had just stopped making herself small to soothe other people's egos. And she hadn't left. She had been pushed. After we hung up, I didn't feel sad, not exactly. I felt clear, like something in me had clicked into place. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the wind brush the trees, and I thought about what it means to be part of a family. Not just by blood, not just by name, but by choice, by action, by how we show up when it's hard. They had made their choice. They chose to exile her, to rewrite the family album with her torn out of the photos. Now it was my turn to choose. I went to the drawer in my desk and pulled out the envelope with the spare house keys, the set I always kept tucked away in case of emergencies. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, thought of how many times she'd used them, how many times she'd let herself in quietly and curled up on my couch, cheeks wet from crying. She used to call my home her safe room, her quiet place. And I knew in that moment it was time to give it back to her. Not just the physical space, but the knowing that she still had somewhere to go, somewhere she was wanted. I placed the keys in a fresh envelope. No note, no flourish, just a small symbol of love that didn't need to shout to be heard. And I called him again. Her ex, her refuge. I want to give these to her, I said softly, but I think it'll mean more if you're the one to bring them. He didn't ask why, he just said I will. The next morning I walked into the kitchen with that envelope in my hand, feeling its weight as something more than just keys. It felt like a promise, like all the things I hadn't said now pressed between paper folds. The house was quiet. No footsteps overhead, no pans clattering, just the soft tick of the wall clock, and the hush of my slippers brushing the floor. I sat down at the table, the same table they'd gathered around laughing while her absence went unspoken, and I set the envelope in the center gently. There was something ceremonial in that, as though I were laying a seed into soil, hoping it would bloom something better than what came before. I sipped my tea and stared at it. My hand rested beside it, fingers barely touching the edge. I thought about how many times I'd seen her at this table years ago, curled over her homework, sketching something in the margins. I remembered her chin in her palm humming to herself. I remembered her telling me once, "I don't feel like I belong anywhere but here." And I remembered how I'd smiled, how I'd told her this would always be her home. I hadn't kept that promise, not really. I let time and other people's decisions and my own fear of rocking the boat come between us. I let her slip away quietly, like steam off a kettle. But the thing about steam is it rises. It doesn't disappear. It just moves upward, waiting to be seen. Around midday, I called her ex again. No hesitation this time, just the quiet confidence of a woman who'd decided. I told him I was ready, that I wanted him to meet me by the old willow tree at the edge of town, the one she used to climb when she was young, the one whose bark still bore the faint initials she carved when she was 12. He agreed without pause. I drove myself, slow and steady, the way I always do now. Windows down, the breeze threading through my hair like fingers that remembered what it meant to be alive. It wasn't far, but every turn in the road felt like a memory. Every shadow like a ghost brushing past. I passed the park where she had her first scraped knee, the corner store where she once spent all her allowance on glitter pens and candy, the small library she used to hide in when the world got too loud. And finally I pulled up beside the willow, its branches bowed low, like a mother's arms still and wide and waiting. He was already there, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, eyes kind. He looked at me like someone who knew the weight I carried, like someone who carried a version of it himself. I stepped out of the car and walked toward him, the envelope held close to my chest. Neither of us spoke at first. We just stood under that tree while the wind moved through the leaves, whispering the kinds of things only old trees and old women understand. Then I handed it to him. "These are hers," I said. "They always were." He nodded carefully, reverently, took it like it was something sacred. "I'll make sure she gets them." I looked him in the eye, and for a moment I saw everything she must have seen in him, not perfection, not ease, but steadiness, a kind of loyalty that doesn't waver even when it's not returned. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," I told him. "Just remind her that she still belongs somewhere." His voice was barely more than a whisper. "She never stopped believing in you." That nearly undid me. My throat closed. My heart felt too big for my chest. I looked away, up into the branches above where sunlight filtered through like blessings. I stayed there a while after he left, long after his car disappeared down the winding road. Just me and the tree and the wind. I thought about the years I had wasted being silent, trying to keep the family stitched together, even as it frayed and unraveled. I thought about all the times I bit my tongue instead of speaking truth, all the moments I'd let pass, thinking love meant staying neutral. But it doesn't. Love means standing in the fire when it's for someone who's burning. Love means stepping out of line when the line is wrong. Love means seeing someone really seeing them and choosing them anyway. I realized then that this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about restoration, about reclaiming something that never should have been taken. It wasn't about punishing the others. I wasn't trying to shame them or prove anything. I was simply reaching backward, hand outstretched, hoping she'd still be there to take it. When I returned home, the house felt different, not empty or lighter, as if something had shifted. The air wasn't so still. The light touched the walls more gently. Maybe it was just me. Maybe for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally living according to my own heart, not theirs. I made myself dinner, ate slowly, didn't turn the TV on, just listened to the silence, and this time it didn't ache. It held me. It comforted me. Before bed, I pulled out a photo of her from a drawer, one they hadn't bothered to frame anymore. She was standing in a garden, laughing, her arms outstretched, like she was trying to hug the sky. I placed it on the nightstand. "Welcome home," I whispered. The next morning I woke with a strange stillness in my chest, not emptiness, stillness, like the hush that comes after a long storm when the world hasn't yet remembered how to make noise again. I lingered in bed longer than usual, the sun crawling softly across my bedroom wall, the air carrying that quiet scent of old wood and linen. I watched dust float in the light like tiny fireflies and thought to myself, this is what peace begins to feel like. But peace is never a clean thing. It comes in waves, some sweet, some bitter. That morning, the bitter came first. My son called. It was unusual. He rarely phoned unless he needed something: bank details, insurance papers, a casserole recipe he pretended to remember on his own. But this time, his voice was tight from the very first word. Not warm, not curious, sharp. "I heard you met with him," he said flatly. I didn't even need to ask how. Gossip in our family moves faster than kindness. Someone must have seen the car, recognized him, followed the thread like a hound on a scent. "I did," I said, simply choosing calm over apology. "I wanted to talk." There was a pause, then a bitter laugh, short-clipped, cold. "So what now? You're what? Planning to reunite them? Invite her back in like nothing happened?" I could feel the heat rise in his tone, but I refused to meet it with fire. My voice stayed steady. "She never left. You pushed her out." "You don't know everything that's gone on, Mom," he snapped. "She's not some innocent victim. She makes messes. She causes problems." "And you think that justifies erasing her?" I asked, not inviting her to her own cousin's birthday, talking about her like she's a virus. His silence told me more than any defense ever could. I pressed on gentler now. "I was there when she was born. I held her before you ever did. I saw who she was before life started piling all its weight on her. I know her." "You knew her," he said coldly. "People change." "Yes, they do," I replied. "And sometimes families don't keep up. Sometimes they change in ways that have nothing to do with love and everything to do with convenience." Another silence. Then he sighed, long and bitter. "So what, you're just going to bring him back into our lives after everything?" "I didn't bring him back," I said softly. "I opened a door. That's all. What she chooses to do with it is her decision." He muttered something I couldn't catch, then finally said, "You don't know what you're doing." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the truth is I didn't fully know. I was feeling my way through the dark like anyone else, following the thin thread of what felt right, even if it hurt. But I didn't say any of that. I just ended the call quietly, before his voice could twist into something meaner. Afterward, I sat at the kitchen table, my tea untouched, my hands, trembling not with regret, but with the aftershock of confrontation. It's strange how something so small as a phone call can make you feel like your very bones have shifted. I looked out the window into the backyard where she used to run barefoot through the grass. I remembered the way she'd pick dandelions and call them stars, the way she saw magic in places the rest of us forgot to look. They saw her as a burden. I saw her as a mirror, one they didn't like looking into. The following day, a letter came in the mail. No return address, just my name in a familiar slant. I knew it before I opened it. Her handwriting sharp but delicate, like the girl herself. Inside a single page, no decoration, no apology, just truth. Grandma, I got the keys. First I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw the envelope, your handwriting, and I knew. I don't know what to say. I didn't think anyone would ever stand up for me again. I thought I was going to have to live the rest of my life pretending I didn't miss home. But you reminded me that I'm not crazy, that I didn't imagine the love we had, that someone saw me. Thank you for not forgetting me, for not being like the rest of them. I'm crying as I write this, not because of the keys, but because you still believe in me. I'll take care of the house, I promise. Love, your girl. I sat with that letter in my lap for hours, ran my fingers over the ink as if I could feel her through the paper. I thought of all the times I'd chosen silence, all the moments I let slip by. And yet, here we were, reaching for one another again. I pressed the letter to my chest and whispered into the stillness of the house, "You're not alone anymore." Because maybe the house wasn't the gift. Maybe the choice was. The choice to see her when no one else did, to reach for her when everyone else let go. That evening the air turned soft, the way it does just before rain, all wait and hush. I sat on the porch with her letter folded beside me, still unreadable to anyone else but me, though I must have memorized every line by now. My fingers traced the grain of the wood beneath the armrest, the same porch where she once sat, braiding wildflowers into garlands, her bare feet swinging over the edge. The same porch where she cried into my shoulder after her first heartbreak, both of us wrapped in an old blanket, saying nothing, because sometimes that was enough. The house was quiet in a new way, not empty, but waiting, as if it knew something had shifted, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. A few neighbors passed by, walking their dogs, waving as they always did. I smiled, nodded, but didn't move. I didn't want to go inside yet. I needed to sit with it all, the letter, the confrontation with my son, the flood of memory that came with every word she'd written. I needed to feel all of it. You don't realize how deeply silence can wound until someone breaks it with the truth. She had written to me, not as someone bitter or broken, but as someone relieved, someone who'd been waiting quietly, drowning beneath the surface, and had finally felt a hand reach down into the water. I didn't reply to her letter, not with paper anyway. Instead, I opened every window in the house and let the air in. I went into her old room, the one that had slowly become a holding place for boxes and dust, and I opened the curtains wide. The light poured in golden and forgiving. I began clearing the space, folding old blankets, moving things that didn't belong anymore. I polished the mirror she once used to fix her eyeliner, cleaned the little shelf where she used to line up her books. I didn't know if she would ever stay here again, but that wasn't the point. The point was to make space, to show her that the door was open and the light was on. Later that night, I found myself pulling out the photo albums again, not the ones we show guests all polished and curated with matching outfits and perfect smiles. No, these were the old ones, the messy ones, the ones with photos crooked in the sleeves with red eye and blurred corners and everyone mid-laugh or mid-chew. Real life. I flipped through them slowly, letting my thumb catch the edge of each page, like turning the thin skin of memory itself. And there she was again. Always there, actually. Always right in the middle of everything. Her smile toothy and wide, her arms flung around people who now pretend they don't remember. I traced her face with the pad of my finger and whispered, "You were never the problem." They tried to paint her as chaos, but what she really was truth. and the truth is uncomfortable when you've spent your life building a lie. For years, I thought keeping the peace meant staying silent, that love meant folding myself small to keep from upsetting anyone. But all that ever did was teach the next generation to do the same. My silence had made room for their cruelty, and I was done with that. The next morning, I made a list, not of chores or groceries, a different kind of list. I wrote down the names of people I had allowed to shrink her, family or not. One by one, I wrote them down, and beside each name, I asked myself, do they deserve to stay in my life if they cannot love all of it? The answers came faster than I expected. Some people will say I was turning my back on my own blood, but blood is not always kin. Sometimes kin is the person who shows up at your lowest, the one who sees your mess and says you're still mine. And if that kin is someone's ex, or someone your children don't approve of, or someone who doesn't fit your Christmas card photo, so be it. That afternoon, her ex sent me a picture. It was of her standing in front of the house holding the keys in one hand, the other pressed to her chest, like she didn't quite believe it. Her face was wet with tears, her hair messier than usual, her mouth curled in the kind of smile you only see when someone is seen after a long, lonely time in the dark. She looked like she'd come home. I stared at that photo for what felt like hours, and then I framed it. Right there in the hallway, among the others. I didn't ask permission. I didn't explain myself. I simply made space for her again. And if anyone noticed during their next visit, if their eyes paused on her face, before quickly moving on, that was their discomfort to carry. I had made my choice. She belonged. The first time she returned to the house, it was like watching a ghost step back into her own body. She didn't knock. She never had. I was sitting on the couch, knitting needles still in my lap, when I heard the lock click, the door creak open. I looked up, and there she was, framed in the light, like some lost part of me had finally wandered back home. Her eyes met mine, cautious but open, shimmering, with a kind of disbelief that made my heart ache. I stood slowly, careful not to startle the moment, and she whispered, "Is it really okay that I'm here?" I didn't answer with words. I just stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her, like she was still 10 years old, and I was still the only safe place she knew. She melted into me, her breath hitching her shoulders, trembling. We didn't speak for a long while. We didn't need to. Sometimes the body remembers what the heart forgets, and in that embrace, I think we both remembered everything. Later, we sat at the kitchen table, the one where so much had been ignored, where love had been served with side dishes of judgment and silence. But this time it was just us. 2 cups of tea. Her hands wrapped around the same mug she used to drink from when she stayed over after college breakups and late-night panics. The one with the chip on the handle. The one she'd always insisted I never throw away. She looked around, taking in the space eyes, pausing on the corners where her childhood still lingered in traces. Then her gaze fell on the photo, the one I'd framed and hung without ceremony. Her laugh, small, shocked, escaped before she could stop it. "You put me back on the wall." "You never should have been taken down," I said. She looked at me, then really looked, and I saw the tension break behind her eyes. I thought I had to choose between them and peace. I never thought I'd get to come home without giving up myself. Her words pierced me, not like a knife, but like truth finding its rightful place. I reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have to shrink to fit back in here. If the house feels too small for the truth, it's the house that needs expanding." She smiled. "You always know just what to say." I didn't nod for a long time. We sat for hours talking not just about what had happened, but about everything that came before it. Her silence, her distance, the coldness she received when she tried to speak up. She told me things I hadn't known, things I had missed, cruelties that came wrapped in smiles, invitations that were never sent, words twisted to make her doubt her own memory. I started to believe I was the problem, she said, that maybe I was too sensitive, too intense, that maybe they were right. I shook my head. That's the oldest trick in the book to make a woman believe her pain is a flaw in her character. She squeezed my hand then. But you remembered me. That's what brought me back. It was the kind of conversation you only get once in a lifetime, the kind where both people are finally ready to listen, and not just to words, but to silences, to wounds, to all the invisible threads that had frayed between them. We stitched them back together that day, not perfectly, but lovingly. And that's what mattered. As the sun began to set, she wandered through the house room by room. She lingered in her old bedroom now, fresh and bare, with sunlight catching on the mirror. She traced her fingers along the bookshelf where her favorite stories once lived. I watched from the doorway as she closed her eyes and breathed in the space. When she turned back to me, there were tears in her eyes again. I never thought I'd feel safe here again. You're not just safe, I said. You're welcome. There's a difference. That night I made dinner like I used to. Nothing fancy, just the pasta she loved as a girl, with garlic bread and too much Parmesan. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who know each other beyond words. As she left, she stood on the porch for a long time, looking out into the twilight, keys in her hand. Then she turned to me. You didn't have to do all this. I know, I said. That's why I did. She kissed my cheek, whispered, "Thank you," and drove off into the purple-blue dusk. But the house didn't feel empty when she left. It felt full in a way it hadn't in years, as if the space she'd carved into my life had finally been restored to her. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without waking in the night. The days that followed were quiet but different. Not the hollow quiet I'd grown used to in recent years, the kind that echoes in empty rooms and wraps itself around you like grief. No, this was a living quiet, the kind that holds warmth, like the hush after a lullaby, like the breath before a fire catches. I found myself moving through the house with a kind of reverence, as though her visit had blessed the space. It had always been her home, yes, but now it felt like it again. She texted me the next morning, "I made breakfast in my own kitchen today. It's been years since I felt like it was really mine. Thank you for giving it back to me." I smiled at the screen heart, aching in that sweet way only love can cause, and I replied simply, "It was always yours. I just kept it warm." I started seeing her more after that. Not every day she had her life, her healing, her long walks into herself, but often enough that my soul began to recognize her rhythm again. She'd drop by with a bag of groceries or a new book she wanted me to read. She'd bring leftover soup in mason jars, or sit on the porch with me in the late afternoon light, saying very little and somehow saying everything. One afternoon, I noticed she was humming to herself as she set a plate down in front of me. It was a tune I hadn't heard in years, something I used to sing when she was a baby, when I'd rock her to sleep in the room with the yellow curtains. My heart swelled, not because she remembered, but because some part of her had carried that sound all this time, tucked away in the quiet corners of her. But with her presence came questions, whispers, phone calls, first from my son, then from his wife, then from others in the family who suddenly remembered I existed when the family structure began to shift ever so slightly. It started with polite concern. "Is she staying with you? I heard she's been around the house again." Don't you think it's confusing for everyone? Confusing for whom I wanted to ask. The people who erased her. The ones who rewrote family gatherings like she never existed. But I didn't fight. I didn't explain. I'd done enough of that in my life. Instead, I answered with the simplest truth I knew. She's home. They didn't like that. I could feel it. The tension hummed beneath every word, every tight-lipped smile when they dropped by. My daughter-in-law once stood in the kitchen and glanced toward the photo I'd hung of my granddaughter still framed proudly in the hallway. She didn't say anything, just looked at it too long, then changed the subject. I let her, because that picture wasn't coming down. One evening, I found myself in the attic rummaging through old boxes, not out of nostalgia, but purpose. I was looking for a folder I hadn't opened in years. My will, my instructions, my plans. It had been written at a time when things seemed stable, when the family pretended well, and I believed it, when I still thought loyalty meant silence. But now the paper felt stale, wrong. I read through it line by line, and each sentence stung with all the things I now knew I needed to undo. I pulled out a fresh sheet, picked up my pen, and I began to write again. Not out of spite, not revenge, but clarity. I adjusted the wording, removed names, added one. Not just to ensure she was included, but to name her as home, as keeper of the space that had always been hers long before anyone tried to strip it away. I sealed the new copy in a folder, placed it in the drawer beside my bed, and for the first time in years I felt my shoulders lower. A decision made is a weight lifted. A few nights later, she and I were sitting outside, the sky above us scattered with stars. She leaned into the wicker chair beside me, blanket across her lap, tea cooling in her hands. "You seem lighter lately," she said softly. "I am," I replied. "I think it's because I finally stopped trying to hold up things that were already broken." She nodded. "It's hard to let go of people you love even when they don't love you back the same way." I looked over at her, then the night wind brushing her hair gently across her cheek, and I said, "Letting go isn't always the same as giving up. Sometimes it's just choosing yourself for once." She looked down, swallowed hard. "I'm still learning how to do that." "You're doing it," I whispered, "right now sitting here, being who you are without apology." We sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. And in that stillness, I realized something else. Sometimes restoration doesn't mean everything going back to the way it was. It means building something new out of what remains, something honest, something strong, something that remembers the pain but refuses to be shaped by it alone. The next time the family gathered, another birthday, this time for my great-granddaughter, I saw the change before a word was spoken. It was in their posture, the way they scanned the room, the way they paused at the doorway. My son arrived first, his wife trailing behind, both dressed in careful smiles. I watched them from the armchair in the corner, the one I always claimed before anyone else could. I could feel their hesitation like a cold breeze sneaking through a cracked window. She wasn't there yet, my granddaughter, but they knew she might be. That possibility hung in the air unspoken, but heavy, like a storm gathering behind clouds that refused to break. I didn't offer reassurances. I didn't smooth anything over. I simply sat with my hands folded, watching the scene unfold like a play I no longer needed to act in. It was freeing in a way, to let go of being the glue, of being the one who made everyone feel okay, even when nothing was. And then she arrived. She stepped into the room with quiet confidence, her presence soft, but unmistakable. She wore no armor, no apology, just a long linen coat and that same quiet resilience I had always seen in her, even when no one else did. She greeted the children first, crouched down to their level, laughed with them. In that way, only people who remember pain know how to laugh, full-bodied and honest, as if each sound carried the weight of everything unspoken. Then she stood, and the room shifted. Not in chaos, not in drama, just in gravity, like someone had finally righted the balance. No one said much. There were a few awkward hellos, some nods, a smile or two that didn't quite reach the eyes. But she didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She moved through the room like she belonged there because she did, and I watched my son watch her with something that looked a lot like discomfort, but maybe, just maybe, also a sliver of understanding. He didn't speak to her that day, but he didn't walk out either, and that for now was enough. She found me later in the kitchen where I was cutting slices of pound cake with my old silver knife, the one with the slightly bent tip. She leaned against the doorway and smiled. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm proud. Of me, of you, of me, of us." She stepped closer, reached for a plate, and helped me pass the slices out. We moved through the room together, quiet and certain, a pair of women who had been through the fire and come out softer, not smaller. The children swarmed us for more sugar, and we laughed real laughter this time, not the brittle kind families sometimes trade like currency. At one point, my son came into the kitchen for a drink. He stood across from her, opened the fridge slowly, his movements stiff. She didn't look away. Neither did he. He pulled out a bottle of water, nodded once, then walked out. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing. After the party, she stayed to help clean up. We folded tablecloths, rinsed out dishes, stacked plastic chairs like we always used to, and when the house finally quieted again, she stood in the hallway beneath her own photo. "They'll never say sorry," she said softly. "Maybe not," I replied, "but you don't need their apology to own your place here." She nodded. "It's strange. I used to think I needed them to let me back in, but it wasn't a door they could control, was it?" "No, sweetheart," I said. "The door was always in you." She looked around the house, really looked, then said, "This place, it feels different now." "It is different," I told her, "because we are." That night she didn't go home right away. She stayed late. We sat outside again, the porch lamp flickering gently above us, the night birds, calling somewhere beyond the hedges. We didn't talk much. There's something sacred about being able to share space with someone who doesn't require you to perform. Before she left, she touched my arm gently and said, "You gave me more than a house, Grandma. You gave me back me." I smiled. "You were never gone, just waiting." She hugged me, and for a moment it felt like we were suspended in something timeless. A circle finally closed, a wound finally closed over. After she drove off, I sat alone for a while, watched the headlights fade into the night, and then I whispered into the quiet, "Let them say what they will," because I wasn't afraid anymore. Of their opinions, of their discomfort, of their disapproval. I had chosen the truth, and the truth had come home. The days turned gentle after that. Like the house itself had loosened its shoulders, softened its edges. I moved slower, not from age, but from intention. Every cup I washed, every bed I made, every curtain I drew open felt like part of a quiet ritual of return. Not just her return, but mine too. To myself. To the version of me I had once promised not to lose. She came by more often now, never out of obligation, and never with grand gestures. Sometimes just a visit to bring a new tea she'd discovered, sometimes to sit beside me and sort through old letters. Once she brought a small box of photographs she'd developed from her walks, Foggy woods, cracked sidewalks, sun through laundry lines. They weren't about people, she told me, just places where people had been. I like the stillness, she said. It reminds me that presence doesn't have to be loud. It was a kind of healing I hadn't known I needed, a mending not from apologies, but from presence, from choosing again and again to show up for one another. But not everyone saw it that way. One morning, my daughter-in-law stopped by unexpectedly. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, eyes scanning the walls like they might give her permission to speak. "You've made your decision, haven't you?" she said finally. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes," I said, calm and sure. "I have." "She's complicated," she said, folding and unfolding a napkin between her fingers. "She brings a lot with her. You know that." "So do we all," I replied gently. "Some of us just hide it better." She bristled just a flicker, then said, "You've made it very clear where your loyalty lies." "It's not about loyalty," I said. "It's about love and respect and undoing a harm I let happen under my roof." She looked at me for a long time, then finally said, "You've changed." "I hope so." She left not long after that, her goodbye tight her footsteps quicker than they'd been on the way in. I didn't follow her. I didn't explain. I'd spent too much of my life explaining the softness in me and the firmness it took to protect it. Later that week, I got a card in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. My son, short, clipped, full of the kind of civility that pretends to be concern. "I don't know what's going on with you lately, but I hope you're okay. Just remember who's really been there for you all these years." I read it twice, then tucked it away in a drawer, not out of spite, just to keep the peace in my own heart. Because I knew who had been there for me, and who I had failed to be there for. One night, while she and I sat together on the porch, I told her about the card, about the conversations, about the tension simmering just beneath the surface. She didn't respond with anger or bitterness. She just sighed and said, "They don't have to understand. They just have to live with the fact that you saw me." "I see you now," I said, more clearly than I ever have. She turned to me, then eyes full but steady. Sometimes I still wait for the other shoe to drop, like this is too good, too safe, like I'll blink and it'll all disappear. I took her hand, warm and shaking, and said, "That's the thing about real belonging. It doesn't disappear when someone else's comfort is threatened. It roots itself deeper." She nodded, leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to when she was small, and we stayed that way until the moon rose high and the cicadas began their soft chorus. I realized then that love in its truest form is not about keeping things pretty. It's about standing in the mess and choosing someone anyway. They could call her complicated. They could call her dramatic. They could call her anything they liked. I called her mine. It was early spring when she brought the flowers. I had just stepped out to sweep the front steps, the morning air, still cool enough to nip at my knuckles. And there she was, walking up the path, hair loose around her shoulders, a paper-wrapped bundle of daffodils and lilacs in her arms. She looked like a painting I hadn't seen in years, familiar and surprising all at once. "I saw these at the market," she said. "Thought they'd brighten the house." She didn't need to say more. I took them, gently cradled them, as if they were a newborn, and we arranged them together in the chipped blue vase she'd given me on her 12th birthday. It had a crack near the base now, just like all the best things in this house, worn but whole, fragile but held. We placed the vase in the center of the dining table where sunlight caught the blossoms and spilled gold across the petals. She stepped back to admire them, then looked at me. "I feel like the house is breathing again," she said, "like it remembers who it was." I smiled. "So do I." but not everyone welcomed that breath. A few days later, my other granddaughter called. Her voice, always sweetened at the edges, was tighter than usual. "I heard she's been around a lot," she said. "Careful not to use her name." "She has. She's staying there now." "No," I said calmly, "but she's welcome to." There was a pause, a sharp inhale. Then, "You always take her side." It wasn't the words that stung it was the story behind them, the long-held belief that love is a limited resource, that if I gave more to one, I must be giving less to another. "I'm not choosing sides," I said softly. "I'm choosing truth." "I just think it sends a message," she replied. "It does," I said, "and I'm okay with that." She ended the call soon after, and I sat by the window letting the silence settle again. But this time it didn't feel like a void. It felt like a boundary, and I was learning to honor it. That afternoon, my granddaughter came by again. We sat on the floor of her old room, now emptied of storage boxes, the carpet warm from the sun. She was sorting through a stack of old sketchbooks she'd found in the closet drawings she had made as a teenager, full of jagged lines and too dark shading. They were raw, emotional, alive. "I used to think this stuff was embarrassing," she said, flipping through a page with wild eyes and bleeding trees. "Now I just see a girl trying to make sense of everything." "You were always trying to tell the truth," I said, even when no one was ready to hear it. She looked up at me, then eyes wet, but proud. "Thank you for seeing it now." I reached over, ran my hand gently through her hair. "I'm sorry it took me so long." She leaned her head against my knee like she did when she was little and whispered, "It's okay. I think you were trying to survive in a house that wasn't always kind to the ones who felt too much." I couldn't respond, not with words, but my hand found hers, and we stayed like that for a long time. Two women who had lived through silence and were finally learning how to speak again. That night I wrote another letter, not to be sent, just one I needed to write. "To the girl you were. I'm sorry I let them convince me you were wrong for feeling everything so deeply. I see you now. You were never the storm, they just didn't know how to sit in your rain." I tucked it into the back of one of her sketchbooks, knowing she'd find it one day. Later, as I washed the dinner dishes, I caught a glimpse of her through the kitchen window. She was sitting under the old magnolia tree, barefoot in the grass, drawing something in her lap. Her hair was falling over her face, and every few moments she'd tuck it back with the back of her hand. It was a simple image, but it hit me with the force of a lifetime. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was growing back, and I had helped make the soil safe again. It was a Saturday morning when I found the envelope. Pale green slipped through the mail slot with the other's electric bill catalog, something from the church. I almost missed it. But when I turned it over and saw her handwriting, everything else fell away. Inside, a single card, handmade. Watercolor on one side, a house in soft brushstrokes. Nothing grand, just a simple porch with ivy climbing the rails and golden light in every window. Below it, in her careful script, "The house you gave back to me." I sat down at the kitchen table before reading the inside. My hands shook. There was something about the vulnerability of handmade things that always undid me. And this was her heart stitched to paper. "Grandma, I've been painting again. Slowly, quietly. At first it felt silly. Then it felt like breathing. I painted this one after I sat outside the house for an hour last week, just watching the light change in the windows. I didn't come in. I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to remember what safe felt like from the outside, so I could learn how to carry it inside again. I wanted you to, you built that light. You held it when I couldn't. Thank you for unlocking more than a door. You unlocked something in me I thought was lost forever. Love, Always, your girl. I held the card to my chest for a long time, eyes closed, breathing in the words, letting them reach the parts of me still tender from all the years I hadn't spoken up. I had spent so long believing that motherhood meant smoothing everything over, even when it hurt. But this card, this gift, reminded me that real mothering sometimes comes later, in the repair, in the restoration, in saying I failed you once, but I will not fail you again. That afternoon, I took the painting and framed it, hung it right beside the front door so it would be the first thing anyone saw when they came in. A declaration, a testimony, that this house, this home belonged just as much to her as it ever had to anyone else. She stopped by not long after as if she knew without knowing. She stepped inside, saw it immediately, and froze. "You hung it," she said barely above a whisper. Of course I did. She stared at it, then at me. Sometimes I still worry they're right about me. I took her hands, pulled her gently to the armchair beside me. "Let me be clear about something," I said. "People will always resent the ones who don't fold." Her eyes welled up and I continued. "You didn't fold. You didn't twist yourself into something easier, and they punished you for it. That doesn't make you wrong. That makes you real." She smiled, then small and warm, like dawn breaking over the horizon. "You know," she said, "when they said I wasn't welcome at the party, I didn't cry at first. I just sat in the car and stared at the dashboard for hours, and I remember thinking, if my own family thinks I'm too much, maybe I am." My heart ached heavy and hollow. "I hate that you ever felt that way. But now," she said, "now I know better. Because you reminded me." She looked around the room, taking in every framed photo, every blanket, every faint echo of laughter that still lingered in the walls. "I feel like I'm allowed to exist again," she whispered. "You were always allowed," I said. "They just forgot how to make space." We spent the rest of the day reorganizing the bookshelf in the hallway. She alphabetized while I dusted, the two of us working, like we had 100 times, before comfortable in the silence and the shared rhythm of ordinary love. Later, she brought me a cup of tea and sat at my feet like she used to, as a girl, her head resting on my knees. I brushed her hair back with the same hands that once rocked her to sleep. "I don't know what the future looks like," she said. "I don't know if they'll ever accept me again." "You don't need their permission to be whole," I told her, "and you don't need their welcome to come home." She closed her eyes and let the words settle into her, and I knew without doubt that she believed me. It wasn't about the house anymore. It never really was. It was about something deeper, older, the kind of love that doesn't get erased by gossip or time or silence, the kind that waits quietly with the porch light on, the kind that says, "I still see you." It was the first warm day of May when I heard the knock, not at the front door where guests arrived, but the back by the garden. I'd just finished watering the lilies, hands still damp, knees sore from crouching too long in the soil. That knock, soft but certain, struck me as peculiar. Few people use that door anymore. I dried my hands on my apron and opened it to find him standing there. Her ex, or maybe not ex anymore. It was hard to tell with young people how their titles shift like sand underfoot. But one thing was clear: his presence was careful, respectful. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his eyes, like always, looked kind. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside. "Come in." He moved quietly through the kitchen, pausing only to smile at the vase of dried flowers she'd brought last month. He touched the edge of the counter like it was something sacred, as if he remembered how it used to look when she was here more often, when the air was heavier with the smell of lavender and fresh paint and unspoken things. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said finally, "for all of it." I poured 2 cups of tea without asking, without needing to. You were part of the story, I said, setting his cup down, long before anyone else wanted to admit it. He sat slowly, the chair creaking under him, like it had remembered his weight. She's different lately, he said, not trying to fix everything all the time, not apologizing just for breathing. I smiled into my tea. She's learning that survival doesn't require shrinking. He nodded. She talks about you, you know, says you're the reason she came back, that you gave her something no one else could. I looked out the window where the sun fell lazily through the leaves. I just reminded her who she's always been. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope, plain simple. He slid it across the table. I helped her with this, he said. She wanted you to have it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a deed. She was signing the house back to me, not to take it away, but to share it. She said she wants to build something new, he added, but she wants you to know the house will always be yours. I held the paper in my hands, the ink still fresh, her signature curling at the bottom like a ribbon of grace. She doesn't owe me this, I said. I know, he said. That's why it means something. We sat there for a while, not saying much. Just 2 people linked by the same girl, the same story, the same ache. And when he left, I walked him out to the garden where the roses were beginning to bloom again after a long sleep. That night she came by. She didn't say anything about the deed, and I didn't mention it. She just stepped inside like the wind placed a pie on the counter and began washing her hands like she belonged there. And she did, more than anyone. As we ate, she asked if I remembered the story of the first time she painted the living room wall without asking. I laughed how she'd chosen a deep forest green that made the whole room feel like dusk even at noon. I was furious, I said, and secretly impressed. I wanted it to feel like a forest. She smiled, like something alive. Well, I said you succeeded. It was too much then. But now I think it would have been perfect. She set her fork down. Funny how too much always turns out to be exactly right when you give it time. I reached for her hand across the table. You're not too much. They were just not enough. She closed her eyes. Sometimes I still wait to be punished for taking up space. Not in this house, I said, not ever again. We washed the dishes in silence the way we always did, the way women have always done, hands submerged in water, while history rinses itself clean in their quiet. When she left that night, she kissed the top of my head and whispered, I'm building something. I don't know what yet, but I want you to be part of it. I didn't cry until the door closed behind her, not from sadness, but from the beautiful ache of being chosen not out of obligation, but love. Later, I opened the window and let the breeze fill the room. It carried a trace of jasmine, the scent she used to wear, the one that lingered on my sweaters for weeks after she stayed over. I stood in the hallway, then looked up at her framed photo, and beside it I placed the deed, a quiet symbol of what had been given back, not just walls and floors, but the truth. She had reclaimed herself, and in doing so, she had given me something I never expected, a second chance. The sky turned lavender. The evening I realized the healing was no longer just hers. It had become mine too. It had crept in slowly, without ceremony, in the spaces between our new routines, in the way the house felt warmer, even when the air was cool. I was folding linens in the laundry room, something I'd done 1,000 times before, but that night I paused. I smoothed the corners of each towel, held them to my face, for no reason other than to feel the softness, and I thought to myself, I am no longer waiting for them to change, because I had changed. There was no phone call, no apology, no sudden epiphany from the others, but the ache of needing it was gone. I no longer felt tethered to their approval or haunted by the weight of their silence. The power had shifted slowly and gently back into my hands, and I had given it willingly, quietly to her. She came by that evening with a basket of fresh bread and a bottle of wine. She called it a nothing visit, the kind where she didn't need a reason to come. She just wanted to be near me. Those were the visits I treasured most, the ones that said, I don't need to explain myself anymore. I just need to exist and be loved. We sat on the porch, the shadows long and gold, the sound of birds folding into the quiet. I've been thinking of repainting the house, she said, sipping slowly. Something warm, like a deep honey, or maybe soft clay. You always see color the way others see mood, I told her. She smiled, maybe because I used to feel like too much of both. I turned to her. You're not too much. You're the right size for your own story. She set the glass down and leaned her head back, letting the breeze move her hair across her face. You know what the worst part of it was, she asked. Not being excluded, not even being gossiped about. It was being erased. Like I didn't exist. Like I was a shadow that nobody wanted to acknowledge. I reached for her hand. They tried to write you out. But sweetheart, you've always been the ink. She looked at me, then eyes wide, and I could see the little girl in her, the one who used to ask me if the moon followed her home. I could see the teenager with the broken voice and the burning questions. I could see the woman finally whole, finally grounded. And I saw myself too. Not just the mother or the grandmother or the hostess. I saw the part of me I had buried long ago, the woman who was allowed to choose. The woman who didn't have to carry everyone's comfort on her back like a second spine. The woman who could say, no more pretending. This is who I love. This is who I stand with. As the sun dipped low, she leaned against my shoulder and whispered, I know we lost time. But somehow, this feels like it was always waiting for us. We didn't lose it, I said. We just folded it into the quiet until we were ready. That night after she left, I wandered the house like it was a museum of memory. Every hallway hummed with something I could finally bear to face. Her old slippers by the door. A candle she once left half burned in the bathroom. A note she wrote me years ago, still tucked inside the drawer with the twist ties, and the birthday candles. I pulled open that drawer, held the note to my chest, and whispered, You came back. And more than that, she stayed. Because when people feel seen, they stop running. And when people are loved, they stop shrinking. The house, once heavy with absence, now breathed with the fullness of return. She had been cast out. But I gave her the keys, and she used them not to reclaim what was stolen, but to build something new. For both of us. Now the days are slower, softer. I wake to light slipping gently through the curtains, not rushing, not pushing, just arriving. Like her, like healing. The house no longer aches the way it used to. It creaks like an old tree, sure of its roots, welcoming the breeze without fear of breaking. Some mornings I sit in the living room with my tea and listen to the quiet. Not the empty kind, but the peaceful kind. The kind that says you've done enough. She visits often sometimes with paint on her hands, sometimes with silence in her eyes. We speak in the language of presence, folding towels together, sharing a meal, rearranging books we've already read. The extraordinary stitched into the ordinary. And every time she steps through the door, I know I made the right choice. I think about what they said about her not belonging, about keeping the family vibe intact. But what they never understood was that family isn't something you preserve like a photograph. It's something you choose to protect moment by moment, especially when it's hard. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. I didn't have to win their approval. I just had to look at the girl I once rocked to sleep and say, You still belong. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. So I gave her the keys. And in the quiet that followed, we found something stronger than forgiveness. We found truth. I gave her silence. And in it I found peace.